The world watched in shock as Taliban fighters flooded into the Afghan capital of Kabul and President Ashraf Ghani fled his own country over the weekend. As the United States continued to withdraw its troops, putting an end to its so-called forever war, 20 years of efforts to contain terrorism and rebuild the Afghan nation came crumbling down in just days. So what is left of this 20-year war now that the Taliban is back in charge, and what is to come for its people? Today we welcome back Dr. Sajjan GOHEL, International Security Director of Asia Pacific Foundation and visiting teacher at the London School of Economics and Political Science. It's lovely to have you back with us. Thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Well, first of all, US President Joe Biden, he said last month that it's highly unlikely that the Taliban would overrun and take control of Afghanistan. And he also said that the Taliban is not the North Vietnamese army and there wouldn't be people being airlifted out of the US embassy. But he was clearly wrong. And while his administration has blamed bad intelligence, but how could they have been so clearly wrong, especially when experts like yourself were warning of a takeover for months? I mean, what did they miscalculate?
Well, yes, indeed. I don't necessarily have the same access to intelligence that President Biden has, but I was concerned, deeply concerned, that a Taliban takeover was going to be inevitable the moment President Biden announced the intention to withdraw US troops, because it killed morale within the Afghan National Army. People began to panic. It created uncertainty. President Biden did not handle this very well. He didn't consult with his allies, like the United Kingdom and other NATO members. He made a quite arbitrary decision, which I would also point out was against the advice of his own military and intelligence communities. And the other thing was that they were warning him that the situation on the ground is far more precarious, and that even though there are some 300,000 members of the Afghan National Army on paper, that does not reflect the situation on the ground. And yet President Biden continued to ignore the advice of his own intelligence and military communities. And unfortunately, we are now in this terrible situation where the Taliban has taken over all of Afghanistan, which they couldn't even achieve in the 1990s. And now the fate of millions of Afghans could be decided by this very rigid, dogmatic militia that has very close ties to al-Qaeda.
And we could definitely see the last time we spoke that the US couldn't get out of there fast enough under President Joe Biden's orders. And, well, you said that since the day the US announced its withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Taliban basically knew that they won. And it clearly goes to, I mean, we can clearly see that the offensive went quite well, and Afghan security forces and regional leaders, they showed very little resistance. How much of the Afghan government is actually left standing?
Well, the Afghan government itself, that was once led by then President Ashraf Ghani, has effectively dissolved. He has moved to Uzbekistan, vacated before the Taliban formally took Kabul. What is interesting is that the first vice president of his administration, Amrullah Saleh, has relocated to the Panjshir Valley and has announced his intention to mount a challenge to the Taliban. And he is being supported by the legendary Northern Alliance leader Ahmed Shah Massoud's son. So there are perhaps a reminder that the battle is not completely over when it comes to the conquest of Afghanistan. It's going to be a tough challenge to counter the Taliban, but they have not succeeded in taking every part of the country. So there are still some elements that are opposed to the Taliban and intend to fight them.
Well, sitting in the presidential palace, they seemed quite confident that they had taken over, but of course they do seem a bit self-conscious at the same time of the international sort of response to its takeover. And well, it's been saying that it comes in peace and that it's going to talk to Afghan government officials. But is there much of a peaceful transition or settlement left to discuss? I mean, it seems that the Taliban already has everything it wants.
You're absolutely right. The Taliban has exactly what it had wanted to achieve. It has not had to compromise or negotiate with any of its rivals or with the West. They now will decide the future of the country. They may include some opposition members of the previous administrations, partly for window dressing, to kind of show the public in Afghanistan, but also the international community, that they've changed, that they've moderated. But you have to keep in mind that the Taliban is now running the country, and they will decide everything when it comes to the lives of Afghans, on women's affairs, on education, on the military, and even who they may end up allowing to live in Afghanistan, such as terrorist groups. So unfortunately, the Taliban now decide everything, and there is no real alternative for the time being unless there is an opposition that grows in strength over a period of time, but it's not going to happen anytime soon.
And what do you think the Taliban has in mind for the future of Afghanistan, and what kind of governance system is it going to establish?
Well, they keep talking about a government system based on Sharia law, on Islamic law. But you have to keep in mind that the governments of Afghanistan, the democratically elected governments, were part of the Islamic State of Afghanistan, so the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So they were quite a religious country in any case. And the fact that the Taliban was saying that that wasn't religious enough perhaps illustrates their mindset. Now, they had given a press conference in which they had stated that the Taliban is ideologically still the same, but that they have learned their lessons from the past. I am very skeptical that they have learned any lessons, because they are certainly showing that their ideology remains intact. Where perhaps they have changed to some degree is that they've become more media savvy. They've understood the oxygen of publicity to get their messaging out, not just to Afghans, but to the international community. And this is where it becomes more concerning, because what they may be saying in English or through translation for an international audience is not necessarily what is translating on the ground.
Well, the United States has said, it told the Security Council rather, that the international community should ensure that Afghanistan cannot ever again be a base for terrorism, and it urged the country's neighbours and others in the region and beyond to give refuge to Afghans attempting to flee. But is it possible to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a hotbed for terrorism without Western presence on the ground and very limited air power?
So this is the key question. The reality is that by President Biden taking out US troops and in effect all NATO troops, what's happened is that there is now no ground intelligence on what is taking place inside the country. President Biden talks about over-the-horizon counterterrorism operations, offshore strategy. But the thing is this, is that you are then dependent on other countries to be able to travel through in order to conduct those operations. And if there is a terrorist group in Afghanistan that is operating there, it is going to take hours at the minimum for a US aircraft to be able to fly over, by which time the terrorists will have moved and they may have even been given an alert as to what's going on. So the West, unfortunately, is losing a very strategic counterterrorism presence. I would also point out to you that without having that presence in Afghanistan, the operation to kill Osama bin Laden 10 years ago would never have been possible. And therefore now there will be greater dependency on countries like Pakistan to help. But the problem there is that Pakistan has very close ties to the Taliban, and many Afghans believe were responsible for helping the Taliban come back to power. And unfortunately, the Pakistani military retains very murky ties, not just with the Taliban, but with other terrorist groups as well. So the problems now have become more complicated, and a needless crisis has been created when it didn't actually have to come to this.
And well, for America, it's trying to wash its hands clean, and it's made it very clear that it's no longer in their interest to stay in Afghanistan, and that they've completed their Operation Enduring Freedom a while ago. So with its withdrawal, it seems to have gotten what it's wanted, and so has the Taliban. But what do the Afghan people want? I mean, what does this 20-year war leave them with?
Well, we need to, I think, draw a distinction between the Biden administration and perhaps what most American experts and advisors and counterterrorism were actually saying, because this is a Biden withdrawal. This is not necessarily an American withdrawal, because President Biden has gone against the advice of his military and his intelligence community and law enforcement community. The Afghans do feel let down, but they feel let down by President Biden. I think what is so touching is that many Afghans were writing to their American friends to say, we don't blame you for what's happening. And if we can survive this, we hope to be able to meet you again. And it was a very emotionally challenging time because a lot of Americans invested their time, their blood, sweat, and tears into Afghanistan, into helping build the country. And many Afghans, what they want are the hard-earned gains over the last 20 years to be maintained, such as civil society, gender equality, rule of law, independent media. These are huge achievements in Afghanistan, which in many ways have actually been successes against extremism and counterterrorism, especially gender equality, because gender equality is the ultimate vaccine against extremism. And that is where the concern comes with the Taliban, because the Taliban are a misogynistic cult. They are anti-women. And that is what the problem that we now face, is that are they going to erode all these hard-earned gains and take Afghanistan back to a period of time and darkness, which was also a cesspool for terrorism?
Well, how do you think the Biden administration is going to address the situation in the days and weeks to come? Do you think it's hoping that regional leaders will get involved, and do you think it's passing the buck?
Well, right now it seems the blame game has started within the Biden administration, where the various branches of his government are finding fault with each other as to who really is responsible for this chaos, this catastrophe that has taken place. Ultimately, we should remember that the military, the intelligence community should not be blamed in America. This was a political decision. President Biden has never had much empathy for Afghanistan. In 2010, he was talking about wanting to withdraw troops. In his own speech, he said he was against the surge under President Obama when he was vice president. So unfortunately, there is not much that can really be done now to deal with this Taliban regime. The most that the U.S. can do, which the U.S. Army is doing, the U.S. military, I should say, is doing with great effect, is trying to take Afghans out of the country, as many as they can, as safely and securely as is possible, because a lot of Afghans fear what the Taliban could do to them. There are already what are known as kill lists, where Taliban leaders and fighters are going to homes of Afghans that worked with the coalition, and they are murdering them. Women are being abducted from their homes. So whatever the Taliban may be saying about giving women their rights, about giving amnesty to people, that's not necessarily translating on the ground by their fighters. And that's the thing, is that we need to keep a close eye on Taliban violations of human rights and civil liberties and undermining gender equality.
Well, the withdrawal of US troops has been quite nerve-wracking for America's allies around the world. And well, Jake Sullivan said a few hours ago that the US isn't going to pull troops out of South Korea or Europe. What does this tell you about America's foreign policy or strategy in going forward?
Well, the thing is this, and it's an interesting comparison with South Korea, because there are some 30,000 troops in South Korea. And even though they may not be engaged in combat operations, the point of having US troops is to provide a degree of support, solidarity, security, and deter aggression from potentially hostile neighbors. Now, the fact that the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan has created this perception, not just amongst terrorist groups, but amongst other countries, that the West is showing weakness, that the West is potentially not as strong as it has been in the past. That creates instability regionally, and it can also create insecurity too. The problem is that if there is a lack of confidence in a particular administration, no one is opposed to the fact that eventually there had to be a withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. That is one issue aside. But the way to go about doing it should have been more organized, managed, and orderly, not in this chaotic way, which could have been avoided, and President Biden was warned about as well.
And well, now we can't turn back time, but well, in going forward, what is the worst case scenario that needs to be avoided at this point? And what could or should be done by governments around the world to protect the political and human rights of Afghans?
Well, some people feel that by engaging with the Taliban and talking to them, that is the best way of ensuring that women's rights and civil liberties and counterterrorism efforts are protected. But we have to be very careful that we don't end up legitimizing them and giving them a sense of authority and that they are in control of everyone's fate, where they could potentially use, say, counterterrorism as a blackmailing tool. The worst case scenario is that the Taliban will incrementally erode women's rights. They won't do it all at once like they did in the 1990s. They'll do it slowly over a period of time when people aren't necessarily as focused on Afghanistan as they were before. And they will also potentially allow terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda to set up base in Afghanistan, turning the country once again to be a cesspool for terrorism, which will attract foreign terrorist fighters to plot and plan attacks globally. And that is the concern. And we shouldn't forget that Al-Qaeda has a symbiotic relationship with the Taliban. Ideologically, they're connected, but also through family ties, because Al-Qaeda leaders and Taliban leaders have been marrying into each other's respective families. So even though the Taliban claim they won't harbor terrorists, I don't think we can believe them until there is ample proof. And we shouldn't forget that Al-Qaeda fighters were embedded with Taliban fighters during the recent conquest of Afghanistan.
Well, that was Dr. Sajjan GOHEL, International Security Director of the Asia Pacific Foundation and visiting teacher of LSE. Thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Good talking to you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.